May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, before we get too far this morning, I'd like to first give a bit of a warning about this sermon, because our passage that we just heard from the Gospel of Mark is a tough one. And it's one of those passages that if I do my job and preach it, and you do your job, which is to listen and engage with it, none of us are making it out of this church without taking a little bit of a hit this morning. So the great baseball player and possibly even better quote generator, Yogi Berra, once said, "If you come to a fork in the road, take it." And in our passage from Mark, we see Jesus laying down a pretty serious fork in the road in terms of how we relate to God. So let's use our imaginations a bit this morning. I hope you've had your coffee. And picture yourself leisurely walking down a path through the woods, and that path eventually comes to a fork. And the path splits off to your left and to your right, and there's a sign that points down each of the two ways. One sign says, "The way of the scribes." The other sign says, "The way of the widow." So one path is marked with prestige and good standing before others, but really is the way of self-righteousness, self-deception, and ultimately leads us back to ourselves. The other path is marked by humility and self-sacrifice, but it's motivated by and leads us back to the love and mercy of God that we know in Jesus. So with these two different paths in our mind, let's turn our attention to our passage from Mark. And we find Jesus here in Mark 12 at the temple with his disciples, and Jesus is teaching. And Jesus turns his attention to a group of people called the Scribes, and he offers a warning about them, saying, "Beware of the scribes who like to go about in long robes and to have salutations in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers." And if that wasn't enough, Jesus wraps all of that up by saying that these scribes will receive the greater condemnation. I think it's fair to say that Jesus wasn't a big fan of the scribes. And a bit of context here helps us to understand why. So the scribes were one of the main religious parties of Jesus' time. And much like their friends, the Pharisees, the scribes were experts in all things pertaining to the Jewish law. And as you can tell by their name, some scribes actually had the job of copying down and preserving the scriptures. And one of the main roles of the scribes in Jesus' day was to function within society sort of as lawyer judges. So they could issue documents pertaining to all sorts of things, like marriages, divorces. They could give loans and write certificates that verified those loans. And all of this sounds pretty well and good, right? The scribes cared about the scriptures and the law. They had a really important role in the day-to-day affairs of their communities, and they kept society functioning, stuff you have to do to live. So why all the fuss here, Jesus? Jesus' criticism of the scribes has little to do, though, with their standing in society, but much to do with their spiritual state, the state of their hearts, and the way that they thought about their relationship with God. So just look at this litany of criticism that Jesus levies against them. It all has to do with the fundamental disconnect between the scribes' actions and the state of their hearts. So the scribes loved to wear long robes that showed the rest of the world not only their spiritual superiority, but also their great wealth. And they would greet each other with these long and grand salutations in the marketplace as a show of their standing and power, and to draw attention to themselves. And when they went to the synagogue to worship God, they always made sure that they had the best seat in the house. And when they went to dinner parties, they always sat in the seats of honor. And Jesus says that they loved making long prayers for a pretense, meaning that they loved to pray in a way that made them look extra holy, rather than praying honestly and from the heart. And Jesus also says that the scribes devoured widows' houses. And this is a reference to their role as loan officers and dispute settlers, where scribes would end up in their job having to take away houses from widows who were otherwise defenseless. And you'll remember that caring for orphans and widows is an Old Testament imperative to the leaders of Israel. And it's this one particular action that really demonstrates Jesus' point. These guys are out here dressing in fancy clothes, praying long-winded but spiritually vacuous prayers that flatter themselves, all the while thinking that they're the paragon of virtue and godly living. They smugly sit in the best seats in the synagogue, thinking that they're God's gift to the world, all the while allowing and participating in things God has expressly told them not to do. In Matthew 7, Jesus says that you can tell a lot about a person's spiritual state by the fruit that they produce. And here he's pointing out that, in no uncertain terms, these scribes are bad news, because the spiritual fruit that they're producing is surely rotten. The scribes are self-deluded and self-deceived, thinking that they're godly, while none of their actions line up with godliness at all. Now here's where that warning from earlier starts to kick in. Because this way of the scribes is something I think that each of us know all too well. Because think about how easy it is for each of us to live out our faith in a way that only is focused on the externals. If we just look at Jesus' criticism of the scribes, we can see how easy it is for us to fall into the same trap. So look at the clothes thing. I mean, seriously, you all look great. How long did you spend deciding on what outfit to wear to church today? You know, before I was a priest and had my outfit chosen for me, I spent way too much time on Sunday morning staring into the mirror and trying on 5 different shirts, trying to figure out what I was going to wear. So, just a hint, if this is a problem for you, just become a priest and your life will get a lot easier. And look, there's nothing wrong with looking your best when you come to worship God on a Sunday. But what Jesus is getting at is, why are you trying to look your best at church? Are you dressing up so you look good and people notice you and think you're the kind of person that you want them to think that you are? Or are you dressing up because it helps you get your heart and your mind in the right place to worship the Lord when you come here? And just a note, it's not lost on me that I'm standing up here saying all of this to you while I'm wearing a long robe that tells you that I'm a religious professional. So we're all under the gun here, I think, a bit. And there's a whole bunch of other things that the scribes are doing. And I would take all of those kind of criticisms that Jesus has levied against them, and I would lump them into one big category of projection. So these are all things that the scribes are doing to present an image of holiness to the people that are around them. And I would guess that this whole idea of projection hits close to home for most of us. Because how good are we all at projecting a certain image to the world about what kind of person we are, when we all know well that what's on the inside, that what comes out of our hearts, that the fruit that we bear doesn't totally line up with that image. So in an article that was written back in 2015, the English writer and columnist James Bartholomew coined a term for this sort of projection that we're all so skilled at. And he called it virtue signaling. And this caught on, and it caught on so much so that there's now a definition for it in the Cambridge Dictionary. And the Cambridge Dictionary defines virtue signaling as an attempt to show other people that you are a good person. For example, by expressing opinions that will be acceptable to them. Example, on social media. And the emphasis here is on the show. It's on the external. Because virtue signaling takes all sorts of forms in our lives. So we see it in the brazen political posts that have most recently populated our Facebook news feeds. We might have made those posts ourselves. Or we see it in the moral crusades that we embrace on all of the bumper stickers that we put on the back of our cars that are there to show the world what kind of person we are. And we even see it in what products we buy at the grocery store. Because, of course, only a truly horrible person would buy genetically modified foods that contain artificial colors and flavors and, heaven forbid, corn syrup. And though it's not a religious term, this idea of virtue signaling points us towards what really is a spiritual predicament. And that predicament is this: that it's far easier to project the facade of our own goodness than to actually be good. Or as Bartholomew puts it in his article, saying the right thing violently on Twitter is much easier than real kindness. Jesus is so critical of this way of the scribes because their facade of holiness, their virtue signaling, if you will, keeps them far away from actually knowing God, while at the same time deceiving them into thinking that they're close to Him. And it's precisely their false understanding of godliness that's actually preventing them from obtaining it. So after laying into the scribes, Jesus and those that are around listening to him go and they sit down across from the treasury in the temple. And they sit there and they watch people one after the other come up and put their money into the treasury. And so many rich people come and they put in large sums, but then up comes this poor widow. And the poor widow puts in 2 measly little copper coins that Mark tells us together adds up to a penny. Each of these coins would have been about the wages for 1 day's worth of work. And what does Jesus say about the widow's giving? He says that she, with her 2 copper coins, has contributed more than all of the others. Because while those who gave great sums did so out of their abundance, she has put in everything that she has had, her entire living. And notice here that Jesus' warning to the scribes from earlier and this widow's offering are deeply connected. And I would even say that they are intentionally connected by Jesus. And Jesus connects these 2 events in order to show the contrast between these 2 vastly different ways of relating to God. So the scribes lived in a world of wealth and status and power. They were able to rely upon themselves to live and to eat and to provide for their families. But this widow would have found herself utterly dependent on others for survival. Without a husband, she would have had to rely on odd jobs and the kindness of others, really, simply to make ends meet. And what spiritual fruit, then, do we see in each of them? The scribes were confident in themselves. They became puffed up, self-righteous, arrogant. They used their position of power to inflict further suffering on the weak and the vulnerable, on the widow, just like this one. The widow, though, despite having almost nothing, demonstrates a radical dependency on the goodness of God. Because in order for her to give away all that she has, we have to assume that she had some true sense of trust that God would take care of her. That when push came to shove, her well-being didn't depend on what meager income she could scrounge up, but instead it depended on a God of grace and love who saw her as his own daughter, who saw her as someone of infinite worth, even though she, because of her low social standing, could walk down the street on any given day and only have a handful of people actually acknowledge her existence. And this is why Jesus points out how great her offering is. It's not because the temple could afford to do anything with her 2 coins, but it's because of the deep faith and trust in God that her giving demonstrated. That faith was the offering that Jesus saw and accepted as far more valuable than money offered out of abundance. And now here's the point of the sermon where I wish I could stand up here in this pulpit in my long robe and exhort myself and you to be more like this widow. To tell you to leave here today and to go home and to gather up all the things you have and own and come back and lay them at the feet of Jesus, and that we could all fully trust that if we did that, God would provide for us. The truth is, I don't have enough faith to do that myself. And I doubt that you do either. Who, if you do, Clay Tullis, our financial administrator, would love to hear from you. But what I do know is this: I am deeply aware of my own tendency to be just like those scribes, to be self-deceived, to be self-righteous, to live a life where I spend more time projecting who I wish I was and who I want others to see me as, rather than asking God to come and to deal with who I actually am. And this tendency lives within you too. It lives within all of us because we all share the same fundamental problem of sin. But I'm also deeply aware that every now and then I get a little glimpse into the spiritual life of what that widow was like, of a relationship with God that's marked by a deep trust and a deep dependency on God and his grace. And it is glorious. Most of you probably have some idea of what I'm talking about, because I think we most get those glimpses in the moments when God strips away something from us that our hearts were clinging to for identity or for worth or for security that weren't him. And when it's taken away, it hurts. We feel unsafe, we feel insecure, we feel abandoned. Oftentimes we think our life is over. Sometimes we think we might die. But every time that I've experienced one of those moments, when I felt just like that widow, alone with no one to help me, with no one to protect me, Jesus always comes. He shows up and he meets me there with his supremely trustworthy and all-sufficient grace. And my goodness, that grace is freeing. God's desire for you and for me is to liberate us from the self-delusion of our own righteousness, to save us from our schemes of counterfeit holiness, which at their best can only ever really be a laughable facade. And God so desired our freedom that he sent his Son among us to make it so. Jesus became poor, just like this widow, so that we might be made rich, co-heirs with him in his heavenly kingdom. Unlike the scribes, Jesus not only knew the true meaning of the law, but he also perfectly kept that law on our behalf, and he's credited his righteousness to us as if it were our own. And you know, there's no need for us then to manufacture this fake external holiness when God himself provides for us the best righteousness there is, that of his Son. And while this widow gave all of her money, Jesus came and gave all of himself, even to the point of death, even death on a cross, laying down his life that we might be free. May God every single day deliver us from the error of the scribes, from a life of self-deception and projection, from a life that's built on anything other than the righteousness of Jesus and the forgiveness that we have in him. And in response to Jesus and his grace, may we become more like that widow, ever growing in our trust of him, ever growing in our dependency on him to meet our every need, and more knowing and living in that freedom that he has won for us. Amen.